Happy to be here and to present our research on Siemens PLCs and the fact that we were able to write a worm running on these PLCs. And, well, who are we? Who are we? Well, we're a small German-based company. We are doing mostly Linux security, but a lot of pen testing in the embedded and RFID and PLC or industrial control system area as well. And Mike here is doing mostly the PLC or industrial control system research at my company. And we would like to present you now, as I said, our current research on PLCs. So at the end, that's why we brought this light show with us. Actually, we were quite happy that we got it twice through security and customs at 2 airports. And weren't picked out and questioned on these funny systems. At the end, we will show you that we have a worm which is capable of actually propagating through these Siemens PLCs without any support by a PC or any different system. So it's a worm which is only running on the PLC. We will infect the first one, and then this PLC will start infecting the rest of the PLCs in this little plant we've got here. And to take the takeaway away already at the beginning, the idea behind this is that the PLCs are not the target of the attack at the end, but the PLCs might even be the source of the attack. So imagine a PLC which comes infected, a machine which is controlled by a PLC and which was infected either by the vendor or maybe on the way to your plant, and you install this machine in your plant. This machine may then afterwards infect your whole plant, because there are probably no security controls within your industrial network anymore, and the attack doesn't come from the outside, but the attack actually is sourced from the PLC. And there's, as I said, no PC required, no other operating system required to actually do the attack. So, let's see. We're demonstrating this based on a Siemens PLC. We'll talk about other vendors at the end. We chose a very small Siemens PLC. This is the smallest Siemens PLC which is on the market today. It's the S7 1211. It's built for very small applications. It has got 50K of RAM, 1 megabyte of persistent memory. It has a built-in Ethernet port, and we are basing our research here on the hardware revision 3, which means firmware version 3, which is pretty much compatible to version 2 and version 1. The reason I'm mentioning it this clearly is that the current models you can buy today are the revision 4. The revision 4 has a newly developed protocol, and the attack we're presenting will not run on the current systems. They will just run on the systems if you bought them maybe a year or 2 years ago. So about a year ago, Siemens introduced a new version. Anyway, to understand the whole talk, we will need to talk about some PLCs, or the way the PLCs work first. The way PLCs work is we have the firmware which is running the user application. The user application is written by the electrical engineer to control the machine, and this user application is executed in cycles, as you can see here. At the beginning of each cycle, the firmware will copy the current state of the physical inputs and outputs, which are here controlling the lights, into a so-called process image, and then it will execute one cycle of the user application. And at the end, there will be some additional work done, maybe some communication work, and then we will reduce the cycle. So the user application is, as I said, executed in cycles, and it may not violate the so-called maximum cycle time, which in case of this PLC is 150 milliseconds. So whenever the worm is executed, it may never use more than 150 milliseconds. If you want to program such a thing, PLCs are programmed a little bit different than normal user applications running on desktop PCs and stuff like that. Each vendor usually has its own terms, but they are mostly similar. In Siemens speak, what you do is you write your code in so-called blocks. There is an organization block. The organization block is similar maybe to the main function in C. It's the main entry into the program, to the user application. Then there are function blocks and functions, which are quite similar to functions in any other programming language. The main difference is that a function block may store local variables, which are again available within the next cycle, while a function doesn't have such access to memory, and it cannot store permanently any values. Then there are the system function and system function blocks. Those are the functions which are made available by the vendor, in this case Siemens. And then there are data blocks. Data blocks just store data, any kind of data, booleans, integers, strings, or just data blobs, binary large objects. If you want to develop now software for these PLCs, you can choose between different programming languages. They are even standardized, and they are available with all vendors which build these PLCs. So you can use graphical languages like these ladder diagrams, but you can even use just classic language or classic programming language, which is called structured text, which is similar to Pascal, and that's what we used to implement the worm. Why are there these additional these additional graphical languages? Well, very often these PLCs are programmed by electrical engineers which don't know how to program. They know how to draw an electrical diagram, but they don't know how to program in a programming language, and that's why these additional languages are available. Now, if we want to implement now a worm, let's remember what a worm does. Well, a worm needs to find its targets, then needs to propagate to the target, then needs to activate itself on the target, and then might carry some malicious code, some payload, which enables the attacker to do something bad on these machines. And that's what we actually did. That's what we wrote for these machines. And to give you the technical details on how this actually worked and what we did to do that, I will pass over now to Mike. As I said, Mike did most of this, the analysis of these machines, the analysis of the protocol, and he will give you now the details on how the protocol works.
Okay, thank you, Ralph. If we want to implement a PLC-only worm, we have to implement these different parts in the PLC programming language. And I will show you how we did this step by step. I will start with the target discovery. If you want to find targets on your network, the first thing you need is a characteristic that allows you to identify your targets. All Siemens S7 PLCs have an open TCP port 102. And the user cannot close this port, so it's most likely that you found a Siemens PLC if you see an open TCP port 102 on your network. So the basic idea we had was to implement a port scanner in the PLC programming language. There are two function blocks that helped us with this task. The first is called tcon. It's open a new TCP connection, and tdiscon it closes a new TCP connection. On this slide, we can see the call of the tcon function here. The most important parameters that are passed to this function are the IP address of your target and the port, in our case 102. If we call this function, the firmware will start to process the connection setup in background. And in the next cycle, we come back to this part of the code and call the function again. And this time we can see if the connection was successful or not. If the connection was successful, we found a new Siemens PLC and continue with the infection. If not, we have a little problem because the function does not implement a timeout. That means we need to do it by ourselves. So we have a counter which is incremented every cycle, and if we hit an upper limit, we say, okay, there is no PLC behind this IP address, and we try the next one. Before we do this, we need to call the tdiscom block. It will stop the firmware to try to the IP address, and then we increment the last byte of our 4-byte IP address. So we scan a /24 subnet for the open port 102. Okay, that is the target discovery. The next thing is the carrier. If we want to implement the carrier, our basic idea was to make the PLC behave like the TIA portal, which is the engineering software used by Siemens. Normally, the program is transferred over TCP. So we thought we can implement this protocol in the PLC language with the help of the two functions, tsend and treceive, which allow you to send any TCP data. Okay, the hard part in this step is to understand how the protocol that is used for program transfer is working. We can see it is transported over TCP/IP. Then there are two more transport protocols which are not covered in this talk. And on the top, we can see the interesting protocol. It is called S7COMP+, which allows us to transfer the user program. It's a binary protocol, it's proprietary, and there are huge differences between the old S7 protocol and this new one, which was introduced with the new PLCs. Okay, what we can see on this slide is the first message that is sent from the TIA portal to the PLC if it wants to establish a new connection. Like every message, this message follows a basic layout. We can see every frame starts with the byte 72, and then there's a version field following. There's a length field which tells us how many data is transmitted, and a type field which tells us something about the intention of the message, for example, error or response or request. There's a reserved field, there's a subtype which tells us more about the intention of the message, and there's a sequence number. In the end, there's a frame end delimiter which tells us that the frame ends here. If the delimiter is missing, the frame is continued in the next network packet. Okay, then there are a lot of more bytes between the message head and the frame end delimiter, and as we started our analysis, we had some problems to find any structure in the bytes between. But then we saw that there are a lot of A3 bytes, and we found out that the A3 byte introduces a so-called attribute block. The values that are actually transferred with this protocol are structured in these blocks. Like the messages, each block has a basic layout. You can see it on this slide. After the A3 byte, there's an identification field which tells which information is transferred in this attribute block. Then there's a format field, which is most of the time 0. There's a data type. In this case, it is a string. There's a length field, which tells us how many data is transferred in this attribute block. And in the end, the actual value, in this case the string, is placed. Okay, then we try to parse the attribute blocks, and we failed a lot of the tries because numbers are a little bit encoded are a little bit strange in the attribute blocks. We see two numbers in this example. The first is an identification field, and the second is length. And if a length or a number field starts with 1 bit, there's a following byte which also belongs to the number. So the numbers in this protocol have a dynamic size. The length here starts with 0, so it's only 1 byte. After we understood this, we were able Oh, there's another slide which is important. So what we can see here is the message that is replied by the PLC to the TIA portal after the connection setup message. And we are only interested in one byte, the anti-replay byte. It's an anti-replay challenge. And what you need to know is that you need to record this byte and flip the first bit of this byte and put the result in all your messages you are going to send to the PLC. So it's an anti-replay protection. So the result here in this example is A2, and to complete this connection setup, we send another message and we place this byte here. Okay, there's another interesting message, the program transfer message. It is used for download new program to the PLC. The message head is the same like we saw already. And there are two new fields that are interesting. The first is the block type. As we already mentioned, there are different blocks, for example, OB or function block, or there are some more. And here's the block number. The block number is the slot where the block is stored on the PLC. So in this case 1, it is placed on the slot 1. Then there are a lot of attribute blocks in this message. For example, the modification time, the source code is stored on the PLC, the bytecode that is actually executed by the PLC is stored on the PLC. There are a lot of more informations, and some of them are used by the TIA portal in case that it wants to recover the program out of the PLC. And some only used by the PLC, for example, the bytecode. Okay, then we found some interesting security flaws which are interesting if you want to implement malware for PLCs. So the first problem is that some data is used twice. As I mentioned here is the block number. The block number is transferred in the message head, but it's also transferred here as attribute block. And now the question is, which of these values is used by Siemens? And the answer is both. The first is used by the PLC, and the second value is used by the TIA portal. Now, consider the following situation. You choose a free slot here. For example, let's say 999, which is mostly free. And here, at this value, you choose an already existing number, for example, 1, which is most of the time in use. So what will happen if you download this message? The PLC will check and see, okay, it's a free slot. I place it in my free slot. And the execution of this block will start. If later an engineer wants to check the program, he will use the TIA portal, and the TIA portal will download all blocks that are stored on the PLC. So the TIA portal now has a problem because it sees it uses this block to check what block number each block has, and it sees 2 blocks twice. And this problem is solved by the TIA portal in just displaying 1 block. So this allows us to hide parts of our user program from the TIA portal and from the engineer. Okay, but it's not working with data blocks. There's another problem that some information are stored twice. The first is that the source code is stored on the PLC, and the bytecode is also stored in the PLC. And now we can program a measureless program and download it to the PLC, but we can change only the source code and make the program look like a usual program. So this allows us again to hide some of our code from the TIA portal and the engineer. Yes. There's another interesting thing. The blocks that are only used by the TIA portal can be left out at all. So there's no need to chip the worm source, and it helps us to reduce the whole amount of data that needs to be transferred. Then we implement everything using the TIA portal. We implement the connection setup, we implement the anti-replay protection, and create empty data blocks for the messages that are used by the worm to propagate itself. The question is how this empty message blocks filled. We download the worm application with the help of the TIA portal and record these messages. Then we place the recorded messages in the data blocks. In the end, we can upload everything with our own tool and infect the first PLC. Okay, the carrier is done. Now we need to start the code that we transferred to the PLC. And this part is very easy. Like we mentioned before, the OB block is similar to the main function in C. In Siemens PLCs, there is a possibility that there is more than one main function. So you just need to download your worm as an OB, and the PLC will start the execution. And the original user program is untouched, so we only add a new main function and this is executed. So this part is very easy. Activation function is built in. In the end, we can implement some payloads. So you are part of the user program. You can do a lot of things. For example, you can stop the whole execution of the user program, or you can manipulate the outputs. You have the TCP functions, which allow you to implement a command and control server or some proxy functions. Okay, we have implemented all the different parts, and now we are going to show you that everything is working. I will infect the first PLC with my laptop, and after that I will plug off my laptop, and the worm will spread in the industrial network. After that, I will plug in my laptop again, and we will see that the worm tries to connect to my laptop, where is a command and control server running. Okay.
Hast du das Kamerabild?
Ach klar, warte. Das Kamerabild. Na.
Okay, just for you to see that currently just one PLC is connected. Let's see, wrong way. Okay, now this PLC here at the top left is connected. You see the Ethernet cable going into the PLC. The other PLCs are currently disconnected, so we're making sure that here it's disconnected. So these are the Ethernet ports. We're just making sure that we're just talking to one PLC at the moment. We will later on disconnect the laptop, and then we'll connect the first PLC to the network again, and we'll see the worm spread. Then we will disconnect the original infected PLC so that you can actually see that the worm then actually can propagate from the second PLC to the third and fourth PLC. So let's see. One thing to check for is you will see that during the infection, the PLC will stop for a couple of seconds. This is important because we cannot patch, or our worm cannot patch the PLC while it's running. So you will see the light stopping for a couple of seconds, and then it will start running again, and the original user program will run again, and the worm is running as well. So let's concentrate on the first PLC. Machst du das Bild noch gleichzeitig?
Ja.
As you see, the light stopped, takes a couple of seconds, and now the PLC is running again. So now we plug off the laptop, and I plug in the first PLC. And this now takes a couple of seconds because the first PLC is now scanning the network, and we're now waiting for the second PLC to stop.
Der erwischt ja auch einen anderen, ne? Maybe it will catch the other ones first.
There it is. Takes a couple of seconds. And now the second PLC is running again. So I removed the first PLC. So the PLC we infected first. So now it's the worm that propagated to the second PLC. And we will plug in a third and a fourth. The fourth already stopped. So it was found first. The fourth is running again now. And now we're just waiting for the third one at the bottom left. Come on, there it is. And it's running again as well. So I plug in the first one again, and now we're looking at the command and control server. Okay, the first PLC is already connected. It tells us its IP address. We have to wait for the other PLCs now. Oh, that was the message we saw there is a message from the infection. So currently nothing is connected apparently.
Oh, so it's a problem.
No, you don't have
my
the IP
setup,
address
I
anymore.
think.
Okay. Yeah, IP address is gone. So that's always a problem with live demos. They add the juice to the talk, but they're always difficult to do. So we see 4 PLCs which connected now to our command and control server, and the first thing Mike can do is, for example, modify one of the outputs from one PLC. So we're now connected to it. This would even work, the PLC connects to us, so this would even work through a netted internet access, stuff like that. We have implemented different commands now in the command and control server, so we can modify the output. So let's see. So we can do anything to any output, as you can see. Okay, you stopped the PLC as well? The user program? Or?
No, it's not stopped.
Okay, well, can you get the light show running again?
Yeah.
Okay, there we've got the light show again. Something else we implemented, and this was an idea we got from Black Hat last year in Las Vegas. They implemented a proxy. So we can even use the PLC now as a bridgehead into the industrial plant because it connects to ourselves. We can use it as a proxy and run any additional commands across this proxy. So this is a simple SOX proxy. And you can use something like proxy chains, for example, to do an nmap through this for this proxy. And as you can see, these PLCs have 443 open, and it's now scanning for the other ports. 80 is open, so there's a web server running on these PLCs, and so on. We can even implement a little DOS. As I told you, there's this the cycle time limit of 150 milliseconds. And as soon as you violate this cycle time, the firmware on the PLC will actually stop the user application. So that's what happened. Now the user application is stopped, and the PLC internally logs an error, of course. But imagine this happening to your plant, and the machines stop working. So anything else, Ken?
No.
So this is pretty much the demo of this one.
Okay, back to the slides. Now we can have a look on how the worm influenced the PLC. What we have seen was that the execution of the user program was stopped for 10 seconds. It generates a log entry, so you are able to see that there's something strange happening in your network if you check your logs, or maybe you see it directly because every machine which is controlled by a PLC stops for 10 seconds. Okay, as we already mentioned, you can improve this by patch the OB1, for example, online without stopping it. But the worm will get more complex, so we just did not implement this. The worm uses memory, about 38 kilobyte of RAM and about 220 kilobyte of persistent memory. The worm is small enough to fit in all different S7100 models. The cycle time is important. We cannot execute our worm longer than 150 milliseconds because the PLC will go into error mode if we do this. So we measured the maximum time during an infection, the maximum cycle time, and we have seen the maximum time of 7 milliseconds, which matches our exception because most of the time we execute communication functions which run in background and processed by the firmware. Okay, then the next question is how you can remove the worm. You have the possibility to do a factory reset. This will delete the whole user program, including the PLC worm, or you just override the worm OB with your OB, so the execution will stop. The TIA portal will recognize the worm. We can see this on this screenshot. Here in the left corner, we can see the user program which was transferred by an engineer to this PLC, and everything here is green, which means, okay, that is exactly the same program you downloaded to the PLC. And here in the bottom corner, we can see here's a different color. That means that are new blocks. And if an engineer looks at the PLC, we'll see, okay, there's new software. What is that? And maybe he will start to analyze the PLC in more detail. But we can manipulate some attribute blocks in a way that the TIA portal will crash before it actually allows you to analyze the software which is stored on the PLC. Yes, and now I will hand over to Ralph again.
Okay, well, so we've seen that this worm is actually capable of infecting an industrial plant all by itself. We don't need any additional PC or any additional support anymore. So as I said in the beginning, the attack, the PLC is not the target of the attack, but it might always also be the source of the attack. So the attack is actually coming from the PLC. It attacks other PLCs without any additional help from the outside. One more thing, maybe to the work Mike just presented. Mike pretty much did all this analysis on himself using Wireshark and TCP dump, because not that much was known about this new S7 COM Plus protocol Mike told you about. Funnily, another researcher from a totally different background actually analyzed the protocol as well, and there is now a Wireshark dissector for that too. So if you're interested in this protocol, if you have got such a PLC, you can use now Wireshark. You have to install an additional Wireshark dissector, and it pretty much gives you all the information that Mike found out the hard way. If we had known about that work at that time, it would have helped us a lot, I guess. Anyway, now how do we protect our PLCs from such attacks? That's very interesting as well. Siemens has 3 different types of protections which are available for these models. They are called know-how protection, copy protection, and access protection. And we looked at those as well. This is the first time that we actually talk about vulnerabilities we found there, because Siemens closed them about a week or 2 ago. At least they released an advisory on that a week or 2 ago. They closed them earlier. First, the know-how protection. What is the idea behind the know-how protection? The idea behind the know-how protection is that if you actually develop some code for a PLC and you build machines which are controlled by this code, you don't want the other vendors on the market to copy that code, to be able to look at that code. You want to protect your property, your IP. So the idea behind it is that you choose a password, and then using this password, the source code on the PLC is encrypted. So even if you use a TIA porter to retrieve the source code, as Mike told you, the source code is stored on the PLC as well for later retrieval, then this source code is encrypted, and you can only decrypt it if you know the current password. This is actually flawed on this system, on the version 3, hardware revision 3, 2, and 1, for 2 reasons. First of all, the bytecode is not encrypted. And during his work, Mike even wrote a disassembler for the bytecode, which is not the topic of this talk today, but he is able to actually reconstruct the original code just based on the bytecode. But it's flawed for a second reason as well. The know-how protection is stored in the attribute block, as we saw before, and there's this enable flag. And Mike, during his research, Mike wrote tools to talk to the PLCs and to send and retrieve attribute blocks as well. And for one reason or the other, I don't know why, the attribute block on the PLC is not write protected. So what Mike can do with his tools is he can retrieve this attribute block and can just flip the enable flag and write it back. And then the TIA portal will see this attribute block, but it's not enabled, and will happily download the source code. Well, the source code is still encrypted, so you still cannot read it, but at least you can use it. You can access it. So we looked further into this idea and into the know-how protection, and looked at how the key is actually generated. And funnily, the key is just based on the password. So there's nothing else than the password which is used. And actually not the password itself, but the secure hash of the password, which is stored in clear text in the attribute block. So if you can retrieve this attribute block, you've got the hash of the password. You don't need to decrypt this hash. You just use this hash using this formula, and you have the key to decrypt the source code. So you have everything at your fingertips to decrypt the source code, to retrieve and to decrypt the source code. This is fixed in firmware version 4, hardware version 4, and this is a Siemens security advisory from last week or 2 weeks ago, in which they actually admitted the fact and told the community that you need to use hardware revision 4 and firmware revision 4 to actually be protected from this attack. One more thing for you to know is these are all hardware revisions 3, these PLCs we demonstrate the attack on, and we cannot install firmware 4 on these systems. So they are not supported anymore, so they will have this bug for their whole life. So know-how protection actually is broken, and at least on these systems, revision 3. And even if it would work, they would only protect the existing POUs, so the existing blocks. So since we add blocks to the system, they wouldn't even if it would work, it would not prevent the worm from propagating. Then we looked at copy protection, and we thought that copy protection wouldn't protect against the worm anyway, but still we looked at it and looked a little bit closer at it. And the idea behind it is that if you again write code, you want to protect your intellectual property, and you want to make sure that the end user may not copy the user application from one PLC to another PLC. So if you've written a program and you license it to your users, they should not be allowed to use this program on as many PLCs as they want to use them. How is it done? Well, the serial number is implemented in the code, well, it's stored in the code, and the serial number of the PLC should then bind the user application to just this one PLC. Again, the serial number is stored in an attribute block, and the attribute block is not write protected. So you can, not integrity protected. So you can change the serial number to any value you want. And the second thing, which is even more problematic in our eyes, in our view, is that the attribute block is not even evaluated by the PLC. So even although you store the serial number within such an attribute block, this attribute block is not evaluated by the PLC, but it is just evaluated by the TR portal when it wants to program additional PLCs. So the TR portal will see whether, when you retrieve the program from one PLC, that it may only restore the program on the same PLC, but may not copy a second or third PLC. As I said, Mike wrote software that can download and upload arbitrary blocks from the PLCs, and he was able to, well, use this, or implement this copy protection in a program, store it on a PLC, on a valid PLC, retrieve it, and store it on a second PLC, and the PLC would execute it. Again, this is fixed, and again, it's the same security advisory. It's fixed in firmware version 4, and the appropriate tier portal, which is then used with firmware version 4. So that's copy protection. The last protection mechanism which is provided by Siemens is the so-called access protection, and that actually works. Unfortunately, it's not enabled by default. So if you actually do write your user applications, in the version we used, in the tier portal 11, you're not even reminded of the fact that there is such a thing that as an access protection. The newer versions remind you of the fact, and they ask you whether you want to set such a password, but still you can just dismiss that. So if the access protection is off, you have access to all these features. You can transfer programs to the PLC, you can retrieve programs, you can start and stop the PLC. even with the lowest level of the access protection, the so-called write protection, you cannot transfer programs to the PLC anymore. To do that, you will need to provide a password. And this password actually seems to be transferred securely. So there is a challenge response mechanism in place which apparently is secure. We looked into it a little bit. Some other researchers, security researchers, looked at it as well. And at least nobody has found a flaw yet in this algorithm. So that actually seems to work. But as I said, by default, disabled. So what would be improvements and recommendations if you actually use PLCs in your plant or if you're a vendor? Well, if you're a vendor, of course, you should make sure that your engineering software, the software which is used to actually implement the user application on the PLC, enables these security protections by default. Maybe even does not allow the disabling of these protection mechanisms. Then, of course, you should use integrity protection wherever needed, using HMAX or stuff like that. And one other idea is maybe even disallow connections from one PLC to a second PLC using port 102. There might be some valid applications out there, but we are not aware of such applications which need to talk to other PLCs using port 102. At least not on these very small, very simple PLCs. Maybe you could make that configurable information which is by default disallow or disabled, and would have to be enabled if your application actually needs that. In case you're a user, well, enable the access protection if it's not by default, and maybe implement firewall rules. These PLCs actually scan the network, and these PLCs connect to the outside. They're connected to our command and control server. And that's something PLCs usually don't do. Currently, there are even a couple of vendors on the market which sell you intrusion detection systems for these PLCs, which use some kind of machine learning to actually analyze the network traffic in your industrial plant and actually do an anomaly-based intrusion detection, something that I think doesn't work in normal user LANs, user local area networks, but which works very well in industrial plants because as we saw, the user applications are executed in cycles. So it's very repetitive network traffic you see usually. And if suddenly a PLC starts scanning, that's something that should be picked up by these intrusion detection systems. So those are very valid as well, at least for industrial plants, those anomaly-based intrusion detection systems. Okay. Then we thought, what about other vendors? Is this a Siemens-only problem? We didn't actually implement it, but we just looked at other vendors and looked at the fact whether other vendors might be susceptible to this attack as well. What did we need actually to implement the worm? Well, we needed an Ethernet connection. Many vendors now implement Ethernet built in. We needed the fact that the program transfer to the PLC is actually implemented in TCP. So you don't use a USB port or some other proprietary protocol to transfer the program to the PLC. And then within the programming language of the PLC, we needed these TCP functions to be able to initiate new TCP connections. So we took just a look at the current leading vendors. And if you're a vendor and you're not on this list, I'm sorry. So we just took an arbitrary group of leading vendors, Siemens, Mitsubishi, Schneider, and Rockwell Automation. And those models they currently sell. And first we looked at all TCP vendors which have industrial Ethernet connections, industrial Ethernet connectors. and where the program transfer actually is implemented using either TCP or UDP protocols. All vendors are affected actually. The only model that doesn't have industrial Ethernet is this Modicon Easy by Schneider, which is, well, a very, very, very small model. Then we look at those models which actually support TCP IP functions. And as you can see, Siemens, yes, but Mitsubishi as well, Rockwell Automation as well. The only one that doesn't have, or where we didn't find such functions is Mitsubishi, which, Schneider, which doesn't mean that it's not possible actually to do that there, but maybe we just didn't find the correct functions. Other than that, theoretically, all these models are susceptible to the same attack if you don't implement the appropriate security countermeasures. Of course, some of these probably are secure or are very, very much harder to attack than the attack we showed you, like the current S7-1500, for example, from Siemens. This one uses a very new protocol, which is now implemented in the version 4 of the 1200 model as well, and they use much better integrity checking and authentication and even encryption within the protocol. It has been totally revised. So we're currently looking into that, but currently we're not able to replicate this attack on these machines, and we don't know whether it is possible to do that. Okay, for the takeaway message, essentially, be reminded of the fact that these PLCs actually are just PCs. And of course, they have the same vulnerabilities a normal PC has got. Maybe even worse than that, because usually most of these PLCs don't have any built-in security countermeasures. So there's mostly no firewall on these PLCs. They don't require passwords for accessing the PLC. Think about a Telnet server not requiring a password for root access. That's what many of these PLCs are like, especially the older ones. If you look at the most current systems, they are much better. But then again, be reminded of the fact that the life cycle of these machines is often 15 to 30 years. So you buy some kind of machine today which is controlled by such a PLC. The user will not change the PLC within the next 15, 20, or 25 years. Why should he? It's working. And with the common trend of connecting all these machines in your plant to the internet or to your internal network to interconnect and to be able to react, for example, to customer requests very fast and to automate that very fast, we see, some kind of threat coming from these PLCs, because, as I said, they are not just the target of the attack, but in this case, they're even the source of the attack. And as Mike demonstrated, it's very hard for you to verify the code on these systems. Let's imagine that the original user application already has got this copy protection or know-how protection turned on. Mike would make sure that his worm would turn on the know-how protection, copy protection as well. Then you've got the TIA portal, and you want to connect to that system, and you want to retrieve the code. You cannot. There's nothing like a virus scan for PLC code. There's no way to actually verify the integrity of the code running on the PLC. And that's something that has to be tackled by the security vendors as well, not just the vendors of the PLCs. So that's my takeaway, or our takeaway for you from this talk. And that's the end, and we're open for questions. Any question? No? Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope we get this board back to Germany through customs and security. If you have any further questions you want to talk about here in public, we're available today and tomorrow and later at the reception. Well, if not, thank you.